So there's absolutely, there's three things that are fundamental to, I think, professional services firms like ours, right? One is you're actually selling a set of raw horsepower, right? So when someone looks at hiring in an external agency, there's this competence conversation that they always want to feel like I'm hiring some smart people that I feel a great degree in trust in. And so there's this kind of raw layer of horsepower. Then you have to combine that with craft. You can't have just a smart individual. You have to believe that that company or organization has a craft, has a methodology and an approach which you can trust. And you see that, if you're doing a monitoring evaluation, one of the reasons I think JPAL has such a great brand is that it's actually, the belief in a repeated craft that they have where people go, okay, look, I think when a JPAL person comes in, they follow this kind of really rigorous craft, right? And so you have to have that. And then the third is you have to stand on the shoulder of giants.
I think it reminded me of a conversation I was having once with an economist who was basically, and this is not to say it's all economists, but I think he was talking about, it was a statement that was made like, if communities become part of public policy, if they start analyzing and contributing to public policy, what's the role of an expert? What will an expert do if communities start doing it themselves? And that conversation didn't go very far, but I think it got me thinking also about, basically, is there how do you actually be aware of your expertise and yet not be an expert? Actually differentiating between the idea of understanding and being having a certain expertise in a particular subject, but you don't behave like an expert. Just drop the idea of being an expert when you're doing research. And in many ways, relation the points that you were talking about, being whether you're place based or you're just dealing with documents, that is your space. If you This predetermined idea that I'm the expert and I know more, I think that itself comes hinders sometimes hinders research.
That aspect of what was fake expertise was always available. Right? What we call slop now, maybe a year and a half ago, you would say, WhatsApp University, or whenever an event gets triggered, everybody becomes an expert on that event based on what they've read on WhatsApp. So I think different versions of that existed every time and possibly will continue to exist. My only kind of recognition of expertise is that, or at least when I think as to how one framework as to what expertise could be looked at for is, and I'm no expert in AI, but how do you think of delegating problems? So I'm having a coffee, I'm okay with the machine doing it, grinding the beans, putting something together, heating the water and pushing through stew. But let's say if me and my family are gonna drive down or take a flight, what is the do I trust? And if you think of any decision making process which has a large scale impact, trust becomes a real concern. It's not the depth of the information that you're getting. It's not how sharp the analysis is that you've received. It is also about the fact that as to where are you receiving it from, can you trust that particular source of delivery of information?
Before AI, the data in scientific papers can have many forms, right? It can be tables or line graphs or photos. So I, at some point, looked at two photos in a PhD thesis and recognized the two photos were identical, except one was in mirror image. And I'm like, well, I've seen that image before. And I apparently did not have any expertise. I just had the ability to spot that these two images were the same. And I reported that. And then I thought, hey, does this happen more often? And so I started looking for these things just in biomedical scientific papers that had been peer reviewed. And I found, like you already mentioned in the introduction, 4% of these papers had these duplicated images. So I cannot really spot if an image is manipulated. I can spot if I can find a duplication. So the two images could be the same, two images could overlap or be rotated, things like that. Or an image has one photo but duplicated elements. So that's sort of what I'm looking for. This was, of course, all before AI, because as we say in the US, a photo or it didn't happen. Like if you see a photo, if you think about 2, 3, 4 years ago, if you see a photo, it was real, like some real experiment happened. And so you don't really, I feel, need to have an expertise. In my case, it was more, I guess, the ability to recognize these duplications that I'm apparently very good at. So I guess that made me immediately an expert. But when I started searching for these images, if I now go back 10 years or so later, I find much more. And I'm using now also software, not just relying on my eye like I did when I first published my investigation. Now I just use software, which is partially AI based, to help me find these duplications. That is pattern recognition AI, not generative AI. But having said that, I am nowadays not able to recognize a well executed AI generated image. I would not recognize that because I'm just using my eye. And I think generative AI has gotten so good that we cannot distinguish fake from real.
If you compare like a decadal experience, with every passing decade, I think what happens is that evidence-based policy starts gaining more and more traction. With ease and availability of tools that can pick out and synthesize long policy documents and data tables, evidence becomes slightly more easier. So I think when people are looking for information now as compared to 5 years earlier, they are definitely looking for that, not that human anecdotal experience, but also looking at what is data saying. Ease of availability of information also means that they're looking for we can't be the first people who have had this problem with, so how have other people dealt with this problem? So that's another factor that's coming in. But what I was really coming to is, now with so much availability of information, good, bad, whichever way you want to think about it, one thing that's coming out is, earlier, there was some agreement upon what everybody was trying to solve, right? Or there was clarity on what we wanted to solve. Now, with multiplicity of information, with varying degrees, what people are really looking forward is, we can find the solution if we can narrow down the problem. Right? So, do we have an economic problem? Do we have an adaptability problem? What Gaurav was referring to is, do we have an unintended consequences problem based on a solution? So there could be a range of things. And at least federal lawmakers in India are looking to say, I can't make a misstep in identifying the problem. I can make a small misstep in possibly the solution and I can course correct. But if my initial misstep is in what the problem was, then I am in deep trouble.
So I feel science has really, the demands on science have shifted a lot. So it used to be about expertise, science, and quality of research, but it has shifted to quantity, to output. Like, how many papers have you published? How many times have they been cited? Or how many papers has your university published? So really, science has become this metrics game, like gaming the metrics. How can you boost your own resume? So it's not anymore about expertise, it's about how many papers do you publish. And that has resulted, that's already a longer process. Of course, it has been enormously accelerated by AI. So we do see there's already some exponential growth of science, but there's this even more exponential, I don't know how to, that's not very scientific, but like it has gone up and up. The number of papers has enormously grown, and a lot of that is sloppy, is low quality. It's really not about the quality anymore. So we have seen this in, for example, the rise of paper mills. So paper mills are, for those who are not familiar, are sort of entities or businesses that produce very low quality papers, fake papers, and sell the authorship position. So the authors on those papers did not write the papers themselves. They gave some money to the paper mills to be an author. So we have seen enormous rise in certain types of papers that all look very familiar. They use a template, so it might be changing one cancer to another cancer and one molecule to another molecule and one cell line to another cell line. And the possibilities of rearranging pretty much the same paper are endless. The papers are not identical. They're always slightly rewritten. And of course, AI makes that all much more easy to do. We see this enormous output in science papers that journals are struggling with. Peer reviewers there's an enormous demand on peer reviewers. I just was speaking at a conference to people who work at Archive, which is sort of like a preprint server for mathematics and computer scientists. Like the enormous amount of overwhelmed with the enormous amount of manuscripts sent their way. And it's just so hard to distinguish fake from real.
So firstly to say, there's probably a lot you may have heard around how people are not hiring young people, and consulting firms saying, well, why do we need analysts? And investment banks saying, why do we need investment analysts and so forth? So firstly, we have a counter thesis, at least just speaking for Talberg. If you want to sort of embrace how the world is going to change and change at a rapid pace, I can't imagine, my sort of calcified brain being the right person for doing that, right? You want young minds who are quick at adopting and adapting. So firstly, we're investing in young people. Nothing has changed about that. But I do think in the process, and this is something that's going on internally right now, you have to actually start to identify what is good friction. So that's one. And that is a medium to long-term investment where you're correct, that maybe short-term incentives are not there, right? To say, hey, actually, it's important to have some friction in terms of you can't just rely on synthesis by an AI, because unless you've read some of the core texts in that space, you will not be able to tell whether the synthesis is missing something or if it's high quality and so forth. And that sort of internal framing that it develops for you over time is also critical. So how do you actually, in the craft that you're teaching, actually agree and push that there is still going to be end-to-end reading of certain reports, etc., which is friction that frankly is not completely needed for that individual project, but serves us in the long term to create the kind of human beings that we need. And the second thing we think about is cognitive offload. So it's very clear that you get AI to do the first round of thinking, you're already down a rabbit hole. And so within the consulting space, there is craft. There's this whole thing of how do you develop your hypotheses? How do you then think about what drives your hypotheses and therefore the work plans and so forth? And what we are trying to institute is an approach where that's actually completely human first. And then we actually then think about, okay, what might you have missed? So how do you use it as a brainstorm partner after the fact, not before the fact?
I think the tensions have always existed. So whether it's tensions between qualitative, quantitative, which is more important for solutions, or are tech-based solutions better or socially embedded solutions better? I think there have been tensions about how to go about this, how to go about creating solutions or doing research, etc. I think those tensions, if you just extend that to the current context about, is the AI generated information better than the slow cooked information that you need to do those processes, etc., that are there. I think there, the basically, if we move from looking at either one of these being the panacea, now that this panel is actually saying it should be, and really move towards, I think even we move towards those partnership based and collaborative models, which in the past it have really worked when, say, satellite imagery has worked very well with ground truthing, or quantitative data has worked well with qualitative information that has come together. If you take the same thing and you bring it into the current context, in many ways trainings that actually, or creating expertise that is doesn't have, that is embedded in the fact that I don't need to know everything, but I'm open to collaborative work. And where this collaborative work actually is basically coming with the principle that there is a problem, the solution is complex, the solution requires different methodologies, the solution requires different expertise. It's a very basic idea of not going in with your version or your strength, but the strength of the collaborative that really can actually work with. It's almost like having fast food and slow cooked food together, working together. And I think that's the only way forward, because we have to be socially responsible for the solutions we are proposing, and the best case scenario has to be put for that.